They say a courtroom is where truth finally wins. They're wrong. Most days it's where the loudest voice, the biggest bank account, and the best lawyer convince everyone that truth belongs to them. On the morning my divorce hearing began, my father-in-law leaned forward with a smile that barely hid his contempt and declared, "After today you'll never touch another dollar of my son's money." My husband's mistress laughed softly beside him. "She doesn't deserve a single cent," she whispered. I said nothing. Then I handed the judge a sealed envelope. He read only a few lines before bursting into laughter. The smile vanished from every face across the room. In that instant, I realized something I would never forget. Sometimes the quietest person in the courtroom is the one who already knows how the story ends. The courthouse in Norfolk, Virginia smelled faintly of polished wood, fresh coffee, and old paper. It reminded me strangely of military headquarters buildings, where lives could change because of words printed on official documents. I had walked through enough command offices during my 16 years in the Army to recognize the weight carried by silence. Courtrooms had the same feeling. I adjusted the cuff of my navy blue blazer before stepping inside. I had chosen not to wear my Army uniform. That decision surprised nearly everyone. My attorney had asked twice if I was certain. "I don't want sympathy," I had told him. "I want facts." He simply nodded. Across the room, Daniel Brooks was already seated beside his attorney. 12 years of marriage had taught me every expression on his face, yet I hardly recognized the man staring back at me. He looked comfortable, confident, almost entertained. The woman beside him rested one manicured hand lightly on his arm. Emily Carson, 29 years old, marketing consultant. Beautiful in the effortless way that expensive salons and unlimited free afternoons could produce. She caught my eyes for a second, then she smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone nervous about walking into court. It was the smile of someone already spending money she believed belonged to her. My father-in-law, Richard Brooks, stood as I approached my table. At 72, Richard still carried himself like a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a gold watch that had probably cost more than my first car, and the expression that had haunted every holiday dinner throughout my marriage: disappointment. Not anger, not hatred. Simply the conviction that I had never been worthy of his son. He looked me up and down. "No uniform today," he asked loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. I didn't think I'd need one. His lips curled. "Smart choice." Before I could answer, he leaned closer. "After today," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction, "you'll never touch another dollar of my son's money again." Emily couldn't resist adding her own remark. "Honestly," she said with a light laugh, "she doesn't deserve 1 cent. Daniel never corrected either of them. He simply looked away. Oddly enough, that hurt less than I expected. Some wounds stop bleeding long before anyone notices they're there. I sat beside my attorney, Michael Reeves, who quietly slid a folder toward me. Final exhibits. I opened it. Every page sat exactly where I expected, except for one item, a sealed white envelope, untouched. Michael glanced at it. "You still don't want me to submit it until the very end?" "Not yet." He studied my face. "You've waited over a year. I can wait another hour." He gave the smallest nod. Outside those courtroom windows, spring sunlight reflected off parked cars. Inside, fluorescent lights washed everyone in the same pale color, making expensive suits and ordinary jackets appear almost identical. Funny how quickly appearances disappeared under harsh light. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. Judge Harold Whitmore entered with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades watching families destroy themselves over money. Once everyone sat, proceedings began. Daniel's attorney wasted no time. He painted a simple picture. Successful businessman, faithful provider, growing company, generous husband, military wife who was rarely home, marriage that had simply grown apart. I almost admired how cleanly he removed 12 complicated years from the story. No shouting, no betrayal, no sacrifices, just convenient editing. He displayed financial records showing Brooks Industrial Solutions had grown into a company worth several $1,000,000. Every major asset sat in Daniel's name. The family home, investment accounts, commercial property, company ownership, everything. Exactly as Richard had insisted years earlier. "It's simpler," Richard used to say. "Businesses need one decision maker." Back then, I believed families protected each other. Now I understood they sometimes protected only themselves, Daniel testified next. His voice remained calm. I supported Christine's military career. I encouraged her service. I managed everything at home while she was deployed. Listening to him was almost surreal. He wasn't technically lying. He was simply selecting which truths deserved to exist. Yes, I deployed. Twice. Yes, he stayed home. But he never mentioned who paid his graduate school tuition, who sent nearly every deployment bonus directly into our joint account, who postponed promotions to stay near him during difficult years, who refinanced personal savings to help him launch a business when every bank rejected his application. Facts become dangerous when they're incomplete. Emily testified briefly. She insisted their relationship began only after our marriage had emotionally ended. Michael never challenged her. Not yet. Richard volunteered to speak despite not being required. That didn't surprise me. He loved audiences. He described Daniel as hardworking, honorable, generous. Then his eyes settled on me. My son built everything through determination, he declared. Nobody handed him success. He paused dramatically. And now someone wants to profit from work she didn't do. A few people in the gallery nodded. I didn't blame them. If I knew nothing else, I might have believed him too. Michael squeezed my arm gently. Our turn. I stood. The room suddenly felt much quieter, not because anyone respected me, because everyone expected surrender. Michael began asking straightforward questions. My army career, marriage timeline, financial contributions, deployments. I answered calmly. Short sentences, no emotion. Richard looked almost disappointed. Perhaps he wanted tears, maybe anger. Instead, he found discipline. Years in uniform had taught me something valuable. Emotion has its place, just rarely in front of people hoping to use it against you. After nearly 30 minutes, Michael sat down. The judge glanced toward me. Mrs. Brooks, is there anything else? I reached into my leather briefcase. Slowly, carefully. Every eye followed my hands. I removed a single sealed white envelope. No labels, no dramatic markings, just thick ivory paper that had remained unopened for years. Michael didn't touch it. Neither did I. Instead, I placed it gently on counsel's table. I have one final exhibit, Your Honor. Richard chuckled. Daniel smiled confidently. Emily folded her arms. None of them understood why my hands had finally stopped trembling. Because everything that happened today had only been the introduction. The real hearing hadn't even begun. The judge announced a 15-minute recess before the afternoon session. Lawyers gathered their files. Spectators wandered toward the hallway for coffee. Richard Brooks laughed loudly enough for half the courthouse to hear shaking hands with friends who had come expecting to watch his family win one final battle. I stayed where I was. Michael leaned toward me. You okay? I've been through worse. You have. His voice carried the calm confidence of a man who had spent nearly 30 years in courtrooms. Still, he couldn't completely hide his curiosity. You've never told me everything. I smiled faintly. You'll know soon enough. He nodded without pressing further. After 16 years in the army, I'd learned something about trust. Real trust didn't require every answer immediately. Sometimes it simply meant believing someone had a reason for remaining silent. As people slowly returned to the courtroom, my mind drifted backward, not because I wanted to relive the past, but because the present no longer made sense without it. I met Daniel Brooks 17 years earlier. I was 21, fresh out of ROTC, wearing a brand new second lieutenant's bars that still felt too heavy for my shoulders. Daniel was funny, patient, the kind of man who listened instead of waiting for his turn to speak. He wasn't wealthy. Neither was I. We rented a tiny apartment near Fort Campbell where the refrigerator rattled every night, and the air conditioner seemed to lose every battle against Kentucky summers. Those were happy years. On Friday nights, we'd buy cheap takeout, spread old blankets across the living room floor, and dream about the future. I'll start my own company someday, Daniel would say. And I'll probably be stationed somewhere in Alaska. I'd laugh. We'll figure it out. Back then, I believed him. When he proposed, he didn't have an expensive ring. He apologized for it. I promise one day I'll replace it. I kissed him before he finished speaking. You don't have to. I meant every word. The first time I met Richard Brooks, he looked at my uniform longer than he looked at me. So, he finally said, you're planning to stay in the Army? Yes, sir. For how long? I hope until retirement. He didn't smile. My son deserves a wife who's home. Daniel tried to lighten the mood. Dad! Richard ignored him. Military women don't make good wives. The sentence landed softly. Too softly. Sometimes the quietest insults stay with you the longest. Daniel defended me that afternoon. He told his father my career mattered. He insisted we'd make it work. I loved him a little more for that. I wish I could freeze that version of Daniel forever. Because somewhere along the way, he disappeared. Our first years of marriage were difficult but ordinary. Deployments, training exercises, late-night phone calls from different time zones. We missed birthdays, anniversaries, Thanksgivings. We learned to celebrate holidays whenever military schedules allowed. People often thanked me for my service. They never thanked the families who served differently. Daniel carried plenty of weight too, but so did I. Every month, nearly my entire paycheck went into our joint account. Basic pay, housing allowance, hazard pay, deployment bonuses, everything. Daniel wanted to earn his MBA. We couldn't afford tuition, so I volunteered for another overseas assignment because the additional pay would cover it. The night before I deployed, he held me tightly in our kitchen. "I'll make this worth it." "I know you will." During that deployment, internet access came and went depending on where we were operating. Whenever I found a connection, I'd check our bank account before checking social media. Tuition payment, mortgage, utilities, student loans. Every bill got paid. Every time. I remember sitting inside a dusty operations tent one evening after a 14-hour shift, smiling as I read Daniel's message. "One more semester, I couldn't do this without you." Those words carried me through weeks of exhaustion. Years later, I would wonder whether he believed them when he wrote them, or whether he had already learned how easy gratitude was to fake. After graduation, Daniel couldn't find investors. Every bank rejected his business proposal. Too risky, too little collateral, not enough experience. He came home one evening looking defeated. "I guess that's it." "No." He stared at me. "No, we'll find another way." "What way?" I opened my laptop. Military families qualify for programs many civilians never hear about. Low-interest loans, special financial protections, benefits earned through years of service. I spent 3 weeks researching every option available. Finally, I found one. It wasn't enough to build a company outright, but it was enough to begin. When I handed Daniel the approval letter, he looked at me as though I'd performed a miracle. "You did this?" "We did," he cried that night. Real tears. He promised something I'll never forget. "When this company succeeds," he reached across the table and squeezed both of my hands. "Everything I build will belong to both of us." I believed him, not because I was naive, because I loved him. Love has a remarkable ability to silence questions that common sense desperately wants answered. The company grew slowly, then quickly. Contracts became larger. Employees multiplied. Richard suddenly started visiting the office almost every day. He spoke about expansion, investments, real estate, legacy. Every conversation became bigger than the last. Daniel changed almost too gradually to notice. Better suits, longer meetings, more business trips, later nights, different priorities. Whenever I mentioned it, he'd smile. "I'm doing this for us." Then came Emily. At first, she was just another name. Our new marketing consultant. Our branding expert. The client's favorite presenter. Eventually, her name appeared almost daily. One evening, I called Daniel from Fort Bragg after a training exercise. He answered on the third ring. Music played loudly behind him. "You busy?" "Client dinner." A woman's laugh echoed through the phone. "Who was that?" Silence. Then, "Probably someone at the restaurant." I wanted to believe him. Instead, something settled quietly inside my chest. Not certainty. Instinct. Months passed. The evidence arrived one small piece at a time. A hotel receipt folded into his jacket pocket. A restaurant charge made while he claimed to be out of town. A photograph on social media where Emily stood just outside the frame, but her reflection appeared clearly in a restaurant window beside Daniel. Tiny cracks. None large enough alone. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Still, I said nothing. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply started paying attention. Military intelligence teaches observation before action. That lesson served me better in marriage than it ever had overseas. Then, almost exactly 1 year before our divorce filing, something happened that changed everything. I received an unexpected phone call. The voice belonged to someone I hadn't spoken with in nearly a decade. An elderly attorney. His tone was careful, professional. "Major Brooks, I believe I have something that belongs to you." I asked what he meant. There was a long pause. Then he answered with a sentence that would quietly reshape every moment leading to this courtroom. It's time you saw the document your husband hoped you'd never remember." When the call ended, I sat alone in my office for nearly 20 minutes staring at the silent phone. For the first time since discovering Daniel's affair, I wasn't thinking about betrayal. I was thinking about something far more dangerous: the truth. And once I opened that door, there would be no closing it again. The courtroom settled into silence as everyone returned to their seats. The low murmur that had filled the hallway during recess disappeared the moment Judge Whitmore stepped back onto the bench. "Be seated." The sound of chairs scraping against the polished floor echoed briefly before everything became still again. I looked toward the windows for only a second. Outside, the spring afternoon looked warm and peaceful. Inside, the air felt almost heavy enough to breathe. Michael quietly leaned toward me. "This is it." I nodded. "It always was." Across the aisle, Richard Brooks looked more relaxed than he had all morning. He had probably spent the recess accepting congratulations from friends who believed his son was only minutes away from walking out of court victorious. Daniel leaned back in his chair, whispering something to Emily. She laughed. Not loudly. Just enough for me to hear. For a strange moment, I realized I didn't hate either of them anymore. Hatred requires energy. I had spent the last year investing mine somewhere far more productive. Preparation. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Reeves," he said to Michael, "you indicated before recess that your client wished to submit one final exhibit." "Yes, Your Honor." Michael stood. "So noted." He looked toward me. I reached into my briefcase once again. The white envelope felt heavier than paper should. It wasn't because of what it weighed. It was because of what it represented. Promises, choices, consequences. I handed it to Michael without saying a word. He carried it carefully to the clerk, who immediately passed it to the judge. Richard frowned. "What exactly is that?" he asked before his attorney could stop him. Judge Whitmore looked over the rim of his glasses. "You'll have an opportunity to respond if necessary, Mr. Brooks." Richard leaned back, clearly irritated. Emily whispered to Daniel, "Probably another emotional letter." Daniel smiled faintly. "I guess she's trying one last dramatic move." I heard every word. Neither of them noticed. The judge examined the envelope. Old ivory paper. A dark blue wax seal. The edges had yellowed slightly with age. He looked toward Michael. "This appears to be an original document." "It is." "Has it been preserved continuously?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Chain of custody," Michael answered calmly. "We can establish that if the court wishes." Judge Whitmore nodded once. "I'll review it first." The room became so quiet I could hear someone shifting papers near the back row. The judge broke the seal. Carefully, almost respectfully. He unfolded several pages. The first page alone contained enough writing to keep his attention for several moments. His eyes moved steadily from left to right. Then, they stopped. He went back. "Read the same paragraph again." Richard exchanged a confident glance with Daniel. Neither of them seemed concerned. "Not yet." The judge turned another page. He adjusted his glasses. "Read more slowly." His eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. Michael remained perfectly still. I folded my hands together beneath the table. Years of military training had taught me how to control outward emotion. Inside, my heartbeat sounded like distant artillery. Judge Whitmore reached the final page. He stared at the signature block for several long seconds. Then he looked back at the beginning. He reread one particular section. Suddenly, he laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly. It was the surprised laugh of someone who had just discovered the final page of a mystery novel several chapters earlier than expected. He shook his head. "Oh," he smiled despite himself. "That's clever." No one moved. Richard's smile disappeared first. Daniel straightened immediately. Emily looked from one face to another, completely confused. "What is it?" she whispered. Nobody answered. Judge Whitmore placed the document on his bench. He looked directly at Michael. "Counselor." "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you know this was in here?" "I did." "For how long?" "Approximately 11 months. And you deliberately waited until now?" "Yes." The judge gave another quiet laugh. "I believe I understand why." Richard finally stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to know what's so amusing." The judge's expression became serious again. "Sit down, Mr. Brooks." Richard hesitated, then slowly obeyed. Judge Whitmore rested one hand on the document. "I'm not laughing at anyone." He paused. "I'm laughing because after 32 years on this bench..." He glanced down at the papers once more. "I very rarely see legal strategy executed with this level of patience." Daniel's attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, may I review the exhibit?" "You may." The clerk delivered the document. Daniel's attorney began reading. His confidence lasted perhaps 20 seconds. Then his forehead tightened. He flipped to the next page. Back again. Forward. His lips stopped moving. The color slowly drained from his face. Daniel noticed first. "Brian." No response. "Brian." The attorney swallowed. "One moment." Richard leaned toward him. "What is it?" The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued reading. Emily frowned. "This can't be serious." Daniel finally reached for the document himself. His attorney instinctively pulled it back. "No? What?" "Not yet. I asked you what it says." The attorney lowered his voice. "I need to verify something first." Richard had lost all patience. "This is ridiculous." Judge Whitmore looked toward him. "No, Mr. Brooks." His voice remained calm. "It really isn't." The judge tapped the first page gently. "This document raises several legal questions." He tapped the final page. But more importantly, his eyes settled briefly on Richard. "It answers several others." The room remained silent. Every spectator leaned forward. Even the court reporter seemed to pause for half a heartbeat. Emily looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I don't understand." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Neither did he. Only Michael and I remained completely still. The truth had a peculiar rhythm. It almost never exploded into a room. It arrived quietly, then refused to leave. Judge Whitmore closed the file. "I'm calling a 10-minute recess before this exhibit is entered into the record." Daniel's attorney looked relieved. Richard looked terrified. The difference between those expressions fascinated me. One feared losing a case. The other feared remembering something he had hoped the world had forgotten. As the judge stood to leave, he looked directly at me. "Major Parker." "Yes, Your Honor." "I have a feeling." He tapped the sealed papers lightly with one finger. "This isn't simply about money." I met his eyes. "No, sir. It never was." He nodded once before leaving through the chamber door. The gavel had not yet decided the case. But for the first time that day, the Brooks family no longer looked like people waiting to celebrate. They looked like people desperately trying to remember a promise they should never have broken. The 10-minute recess felt much longer. No one in the courtroom spoke above a whisper. Even the hallway outside had lost the casual chatter that usually accompanied a break in proceedings. Word had spread quickly that Judge Whitmore had found something unusual inside an exhibit submitted moments before. When the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. Richard Brooks no longer wore the smug grin that had greeted me that morning. He sat stiffly beside his attorney, one hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly that the knuckles had turned white. Daniel looked from his lawyer to the sealed document on the judge's bench. For the first time all day, he looked uncertain. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She wasn't a legal expert. She couldn't read the expressions around her. But she understood one thing. Confident people don't suddenly stop smiling unless something has gone terribly wrong. Judge Whitmore entered without a word and took his seat. He looked down at the document again before addressing the courtroom. "Before we proceed," he began, "I have carefully reviewed Plaintiff's Exhibit 27. He paused. "This document is authentic." Daniel's attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, we request an opportunity to challenge authenticity." "You already have." "I believe additional testimony may be necessary." Judge Whitmore nodded. "It will be." He turned toward Michael. "Mr. Reeves, you may proceed." Michael stood calmly. "Your Honor, the defense has spent today's hearing presenting Brooks Industrial Solutions as property created solely through Mr. Brooks's personal effort." "Correct." "Our final exhibit demonstrates that this assumption is legally incomplete." Richard slammed one hand against the table. "That's impossible." The judge looked at him. "Mr. Brooks." Richard immediately lowered his voice. "My apologies." Michael approached the witness stand carrying the original document. He placed it carefully before the judge. "Your Honor, 12 years ago, before Brooks Industrial Solutions existed, every commercial lender rejected Mr. Daniel Brooks's business proposal." Daniel stared ahead. He knew that part was true. Michael continued. "Without startup capital, there would have been no company." He turned toward me. "Major Christine Parker located a military lending program available only because of her years of honorable service." Several spectators exchanged surprised looks. Michael continued speaking. "She personally qualified for the loan." Daniel lowered his eyes. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Emily looked at Daniel in confusion. "I didn't know that," she whispered. He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. The truth had begun speaking for itself. Michael lifted another page. The funds were issued exclusively because Major Parker met every eligibility requirement. Judge Whitmore nodded while reviewing the supporting documents attached to the exhibit. I've confirmed that, Michael continued. However, he allowed the word to settle over the room. Major Parker refused to place herself on the company's ownership records. Several people frowned. Judge Whitmore looked up. Explain. Michael smiled faintly. She believed marriage required trust. I felt every eye turn toward me. 12 years earlier, I had been 30 years old, deeply in love, and convinced that protecting my husband was simply part of being a wife. Banks had questioned Daniel's lack of experience. Some investors worried that his debt-to-income ratio made him a poor risk. Adding my military-backed financing would strengthen the application. But there was one problem. If my name appeared publicly as the primary financial guarantor, Daniel feared investors would assume the company depended on his wife rather than on him. I remembered exactly what he had said. I want people to believe I built this. I hadn't argued. Instead, I searched for another solution. Michael continued telling that story. My client consulted family attorney Arthur Kensington. Judge Whitmore looked toward the final pages. The gentleman who signed this agreement, yes, Your Honor. He is still living. He has already provided a sworn affidavit confirming every page. Richard closed his eyes. Only for a second. But I noticed, because at that exact moment, he remembered. Michael continued. Mr. Kensington advised Major Parker that if she wished to protect her financial contribution without publicly claiming ownership, a contingent marital property agreement could be prepared. Judge Whitmore slowly nodded. Go on. The agreement stated that Major Parker would not appear as an owner while the marriage remained intact. Daniel finally spoke. I've never seen this before. Michael turned toward him. No, Daniel shook his head. I would have remembered. Michael remained silent for several seconds. Then he turned another page. Perhaps not. He pointed toward the signature section. Would you recognize your own signature? Daniel looked down. His face froze. There it was. His signature. 12 years younger, followed by mine. Then, one final signature. Richard Brooks, witness. The courtroom became completely silent. Richard whispered almost to himself. I forgot. Judge Whitmore looked directly at him. I'm sorry. Richard swallowed. I forgot we signed it. Michael gently corrected him. No, Mr. Brooks. You didn't simply witness it. He handed another page to the clerk. You insisted on adding one specific clause. Richard's attorney suddenly stood. Objection. On what grounds? Relevance. Judge Whitmore looked at the page. Overruled. Michael read slowly. In the event that Daniel Brooks voluntarily dissolves the marriage through adultery, abandonment, or other substantial marital misconduct, all financial interests directly created by the initial military-backed capital shall be subject to equitable restoration in favor of Christine Parker. No one moved. Even Emily stopped breathing for a moment. Daniel stared at his father. You knew... Richard couldn't answer. Because he had. He had read every page 12 years earlier. He had even insisted that the clause would never matter. His exact words had been, a faithful husband has nothing to fear. Michael looked toward the bench. Your Honor, the irony speaks for itself. Judge Whitmore almost smiled. It certainly does. Daniel suddenly stood. This isn't fair. The judge looked at him calmly. Why not? I made that company successful. No one disputes your effort. I worked day and night. I'm aware. Daniel pointed toward me. She wasn't even there most of the time. I finally spoke. No. The room turned toward me. I was somewhere else. I paused. In Afghanistan. Silence. I was in Poland. Another pause. I was in Kuwait. My voice remained steady. I was serving the country that gave us the program which funded your dream. Daniel couldn't meet my eyes. For years I had never wanted recognition. Only honesty. Judge Whitmore folded his hands. The court has reviewed the financing documents. He looked toward Daniel. The business absolutely benefited from Major Parker's military eligibility. He looked toward Richard. The witness signature has been verified. Finally, he turned toward the final page. And this agreement was never revoked. Daniel's attorney slowly lowered his head. He already knew what came next. The law was no longer on their side. Richard's shoulders seemed to shrink before everyone's eyes. The proud businessman who had entered the courthouse, convinced his family would humiliate his daughter-in-law, now looked like an old man carrying the weight of a decision made more than a decade earlier. Emily leaned toward Daniel. Tell them this isn't real. Daniel said nothing. Because for the first time since our marriage began, he had run out of lies. Judge Whitmore carefully closed the file. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. I believe this court has heard enough regarding the validity of the agreement. He looked around the silent courtroom. We will now proceed to the issue of remedy. As he reached for the next stack of documents, I took my first deep breath all day. The hardest part was over. Now, the consequences would finally begin. The courtroom had fallen into the kind of silence that couldn't be forced. It was the silence that arrived only after every excuse had been exhausted. Judge Whitmore adjusted the papers in front of him one final time before looking across the room. Having reviewed the evidence, the testimony, the financing records, and the contingent marital agreement executed 12 years ago, this court is prepared to issue its ruling. No one moved. Even the air conditioning seemed louder than before. Daniel stared at the bench without blinking. Emily folded her hands tightly in her lap. Richard looked as though he had aged 10 years since that morning. Judge Whitmore continued. The court finds that Major Christine Parker's military-backed financing was the indispensable source of the initial capital used to establish Brooks Industrial Solutions. He paused. The court further finds that the contingent agreement was voluntarily executed by both parties, witnessed, preserved, and never revoked. He turned one page. Finally, the court finds that Mr. Daniel Brooks materially violated the agreement through admitted marital misconduct. Daniel slowly lowered his head. There would be no dramatic objection. No last-minute witness. No miracle. The law had already spoken. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses. Accordingly, the court orders that the marital assets be redistributed in accordance with both the agreement and applicable equitable distribution statutes. He began reading the financial terms. Christine Parker would receive a substantial ownership interest in Brooks Industrial Solutions. She would receive reimbursement for the military-backed capital that had launched the company adjusted for appreciation. She would receive her equitable share of investment accounts accumulated during the marriage. Additional attorney's fees would be assessed against Daniel because the court determined he had unnecessarily prolonged litigation by failing to disclose relevant documents. Every sentence landed like another stone dropped into still water. No one interrupted. No one could. When the judge finally finished, he looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Brooks' success built on another person's sacrifice does not erase that sacrifice, nor does betrayal erase a legally binding promise. Daniel nodded once. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I understand. For the first time in years, I believed him, not because he had suddenly become honest, but because the truth had become impossible to deny. Judge Whitmore signed the final order. His pen made only a few quiet strokes across the paper. 12 years of marriage and months of litigation ended in less than 10 seconds. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck once. People slowly began standing. The spectators filed toward the exit, speaking in hushed voices. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with admiration. Neither mattered. What mattered was something much quieter. The weight I had carried for so many years was finally gone. Michael gathered his files before turning toward me. We did it. I smiled. We followed the truth. He laughed softly. You know, most people would have played this very differently. I know. You never tried to humiliate them. No. You simply waited. I learned patience from the army. He extended his hand. It was an honor. I shook it firmly. The honor was mine. Across the room, Emily was already speaking urgently to Daniel. I thought you said everything belonged to you. Daniel didn't answer. She looked at Richard. Neither man responded. After several uncomfortable seconds, Emily quietly picked up her purse. Without another word, she walked out of the courtroom. She never looked back. Daniel watched her disappear through the wooden doors. There was no anger on his face, only realization. Some people fall in love with success. Very few remain when accountability arrives. I finished placing my documents into my briefcase when I heard slow footsteps behind me. I turned. Richard Brooks stood only a few feet away, for the first time since I had known him. He looked uncertain. I owe you an apology. I waited. He swallowed. I spent 12 years believing my son built everything alone. His voice cracked slightly. I judged you before I ever tried to understand you. I remained silent. He looked toward the courtroom doors. I thought your deployments meant you weren't committed to your family. Another pause. I never understood that every time you left, you were giving something up for all of us. His eyes met mine. I'm sorry, Christine. The apology sounded genuine, but forgiveness and reconciliation are not always the same thing. I smiled politely. I appreciate that. Richard looked relieved for only a moment. Then I added quietly, You spent years judging the uniform. I glanced briefly toward the American flag hanging beside the judge's bench. Without ever seeing the woman wearing it. Richard closed his eyes. There was nothing left to say. He nodded once before walking away. I never saw him again. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt warmer than I remembered. Reporters had gathered near the entrance, hoping for comments. Michael looked at me. Want to say something? I shook my head. No. Aren't you going to celebrate? I smiled. I have somewhere else to be. 2 days later, before sunrise, I parked outside Fort Liberty. The familiar sight of soldiers jogging along the road made me smile. Some carried coffee. Some carried heavy rucksacks. Life had moved forward while my personal world seemed frozen inside that courtroom. I unlocked my office and hung my service jacket neatly beside the door. The gold oak leaves on my shoulders caught the morning light. They represented years of discipline, years of sacrifice, years of choosing duty over comfort. I looked at the framed American flag sitting on the bookshelf behind my desk. Then I quietly whispered something to myself. It was never about winning. Because it wasn't. Money comes and goes. Companies grow and disappear. People disappoint us. Promises are broken. But character is built one decision at a time. That morning, as I watched the first rays of sunlight spread across the parade field, I realized something I wished I had understood years earlier. People thought the strongest thing I carried was my rank. It wasn't. It wasn't the authority. It wasn't the medals. It wasn't even the evidence hidden inside an old envelope. It was patience. Patience to prepare instead of panic. Patience to remain silent when others demanded a reaction. Patience to trust that truth doesn't always arrive first. But it almost always arrives eventually. If this story reminded you that integrity is worth protecting, even when no one else sees your sacrifices, I hope you'll carry that thought with you today. And if you've ever had to choose between bitterness and dignity, I'd truly love to hear your story. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your experiences may encourage someone else who needs hope today. We share stories like this every day, stories about resilience, justice, family, and the quiet strength that often changes everything. If you'd like to join us for more, please subscribe and come back for the next journey. Until then, take care of yourself, and never underestimate the power of quiet patience.